The invitation list for Sarah's wedding arrived like a cold slap in the face. I wasn't some distant cousin nor a forgotten acquaintance from her past. I was her brother, the person who had been her anchor through every chaotic chapter of her adult life. When she lost her footing, I was the one who helped her navigate the wreckage. When she was adrift, I was her compass. Yet, when the time came to curate the most significant guest list of her life, I was deemed an afterthought, a line item to be crossed out in the name of tough cuts. Reading that digital notification on my phone screen felt surreal. I sat in my apartment, staring at the glowing glass, expecting at any moment to see a correction or an apology. But it remained a cold, clinical statement of exclusion. The sheer audacity of it left me reeling. I had poured so much of my own energy into her stability, sacrificing my own peace of mind to ensure she stayed afloat, only to be cast aside like an inconvenience the moment she felt she had reached the finish line. My mother's reaction when I reached out for clarity was the final straw. Rather than acknowledging the sting of betrayal, she retreated into her well-worn pattern of gaslighting. She brushed off my hurt as if it were a childish tantrum, insisting that I was the one being unreasonable. The familiar patronizing tone, the dismissive sighs, the demand that I simply let it go because it was, after all, just a wedding. All of it confirmed what I had long suspected. In their eyes, my role was to be the silent supporter, the one who absorbed the impact of their dysfunction without ever demanding acknowledgement or respect. Something fractured inside me during that conversation. The realization hit with the force of a winter gale off Lake Michigan. I was not a priority. I was an accessory to be used when convenient and discarded when irrelevant. If I was not worthy of a seat at their table, I certainly wasn't going to spend a single second of my life mourning the loss of a place I was never meant to occupy. I closed my laptop and ignored the subsequent flurry of texts. A plan began to crystallize, not born of malice, but of a desperate, long overdue need for self-preservation. I didn't want to spend that weekend in our childhood home, watching them play a polished, artificial version of a happy family while I sat on the sidelines. I wanted distance. I wanted a skyline that didn't feel heavy with expectation. Within the hour, I had secured a suite at a high-end, brutalist-inspired boutique hotel in the heart of downtown Chicago, overlooking the river. I didn't want the warmth of the Caribbean. I wanted the cold, sharp clarity of the city. I booked a room that screamed luxury, a sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass where I could watch the city move beneath me, entirely detached from the drama unfolding in the suburbs. I was no longer the brother who had to show up. I was a man who had decided to show up for himself. I packed a bag, turned off my notifications, and prepared to disappear into the heart of the city, leaving behind the suffocating weight of a family that had forgotten how to treat me as a human being. The decision felt like liberation. For the first time, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I was walking toward the life I had been neglecting to protect their fragile egos. When the weekend of the ceremony arrived, I was already entrenched in my downtown sanctuary. From my suite, I had a panoramic view of the Chicago River, the iconic architecture looming like silent sentinels over the city. I felt an exhilarating detachment. As my family was likely screened around, frantic with logistics and the performative theater of the wedding, I was savoring the silence of a curated, solitary morning. I posted a photo from my balcony, a view of the skyline reflecting off the water, accompanied by a caption that subtly signaled my departure from their narrative. The responses were instantaneous. My cousins, initially confused, began to signal their curiosity, while my aunt, never one to mince words, was the only one who seemed to grasp the defiance in my choice. My mother, however, was predictably frantic. Her texts flooded my notifications, a rapid-fire sequence of interrogations and accusations of pettiness. She seemed genuinely incapable of comprehending how I could choose a quiet weekend in the city over the obligation of the family event. I didn't engage. I set my phone to ignore all incoming alerts and retreated to the hotel's rooftop lounge. The atmosphere was sophisticated and unbothered, a stark contrast to the stifling, high-stakes environment I had been expected to inhabit. I spent the afternoon observing the city's pulse, feeling a profound sense of relief. For years, I had been the one to mediate their crises, the one to manage the fallouts, and the one to apologize when I had done nothing wrong. Here, in the heart of the city, there were no crises to manage, no reputations to uphold, and no roles to play. I was, for the first time, anonymous and free, as the sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long, golden shadows over the loop. The silence was broken by the vibration of my phone. It started as a trickle, then escalated into a torrent. The emergency had arrived, exactly as my intuition had predicted. The messages were no longer about my absence. They were about the absolute disintegration of the day. I opened the thread just enough to grasp the scope of the chaos. The groom had not merely arrived late. He had walked out during the reception, triggering a spectacular, public collapse of the entire event. The venue, which had been meticulously chosen to project a certain image of prosperity, had become the site of a screaming match between my father and uncle, while the wedding party dissolved into a tangle of recriminations and tears. Seeing the details unfold, I didn't feel a shred of remorse. There was no part of me that wished I were there to calm the storm or pick up the pieces. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. My sister had made it clear that I was unnecessary for her happiness. Yet the moment that happiness fractured, the entire family machine had defaulted back to me, expecting me to be the mechanism of their salvation. It was a cycle of reliance that had defined my life, but it ended that evening. I watched the notifications pile up, urgent, demanding, pleading, and with a calm, steady hand, I blocked the numbers one by one. I was not a rescue worker for a disaster I hadn't created. I was finally, unequivocally, unreachable. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my hotel suite, illuminating the remnants of a peaceful, solitary night. The city below was waking up, but the usual anxiety that accompanied a family gathering was entirely absent. I had slept soundly for the first time in months. When I finally reached for my phone, I didn't feel the impulse to check for updates or offer apologies. I was entirely content in my self-imposed isolation. However, the reality of the previous night's catastrophe was waiting for me in the form of nearly 30 missed calls and a barrage of frantic voicemails. Even after blocking them, they had utilized every conceivable loophole: random numbers, burner accounts, and desperate messages left on social media platforms. I listened to a few, driven by a morbid, detached curiosity. The desperation in their voices was palpable. They were scrambling, looking for someone to blame, someone to organize, and someone to soothe the wounded egos that now lay scattered across the reception hall. My mother's voice was the most jarring, a mixture of outrage and genuine terror as she demanded that I return immediately, insisting that the family unit was collapsing because I had abandoned my post. It was as if they truly believed I was the structural integrity of their entire existence. Yet I was the first one they had excluded when the plans were being made. The irony was suffocating. They wanted me present for the labor, for the conflict, and for the support, but never for the celebration. Then came the message from my cousin, who had managed to slip through the digital barricade. She sounded breathless, almost giddy, as she recounted the sheer spectacle of the aftermath. The groom had vanished into the Chicago night without a word, leaving the guests in a state of shell-shocked silence. The venue had cut the bar, the caterers were demanding payment, and the internal family alliances had shattered under the pressure. Apparently, my grandmother had been the most vocal, publicly chastising my sister for her arrogance and lamenting that the day was destined for ruin the moment I was cast aside. Hearing the details, the screaming, the crying, the complete unraveling of the facade they had worked so hard to maintain didn't move me to sympathy. Instead, it confirmed that I had made the correct decision. I was not the cause of their misfortune. I was simply the one who had refused to play a part in it. I spent the remainder of the morning lounging in the hotel spa, letting the heat of the sauna melt away the last vestiges of residual guilt. For years, I had been the family's emotional shock absorber, but in that moment of luxury and stillness, I realized I had finally reclaimed the one thing they had always taken from me, my own agency. I was no longer a character in their chaotic drama. I was the observer of a collapse I had successfully evaded. By midday, the lure of the city had become a quiet, steady rhythm. I sat in a secluded corner of a high-rise garden terrace, watching the wind whip through the trees below. I had no intention of returning to the fray. In fact, the very idea of it felt like a ghost from a life I had already outgrown. My cousin reached out once more, her tone shifting from excitement to a cautious realization of my permanence. She warned me that the family was actively organizing a summit, a desperate, staged intervention designed to corner me the moment I set foot back in my neighborhood, with my mother leading the charge to restore the status quo by force of guilt. I almost laughed at the predictability of it all. They lived in a world where actions had no consequences for the architects, and where my only purpose was to serve as the buffer for their inevitable failures. They assumed I would slide back into my role, chastened and apologetic, simply because they demanded it. They couldn't fathom a reality where I no longer cared for their approval, or where I had finally recognized that my absence was not a betrayal, it was a boundary. I didn't argue. I didn't justify my absence or try to negotiate terms. I simply opened my laptop, extended my stay at the hotel for another week, and sent a final, concise notification to the group. I made it clear that I was not returning to participate in their post-mortem, nor was I interested in assuming the role of the peacemaker once again. They had engineered a wedding without me, and they would have to live with the consequences of that choice entirely on their own. I turned off my phone, not to hide, but to disconnect. The city of Chicago moved on, oblivious to the small, tectonic shift that had occurred in my own life. As I looked out over the skyline, the weight of years of obligation finally dissolved. I realized that the freedom I had been chasing wasn't found in the hotel suite or the luxury of the moment. It was found in the simple, quiet decision to stop sacrificing myself for people who only valued my utility. For the first time, the future wasn't a schedule of family demands. It was a blank page. I signaled the waiter for one last drink, toasted to the quiet, empty space where my family's expectations used to be, and walked out into the city not as a brother, a mediator, or a victim, but as a man who finally belonged to himself. The mess they had created was theirs to clean, and for the first time in my life, I was finally, blissfully, unburdened.